Hi, everybody. My name's Spencer Wallace. I'm a graduate student at the University of Washington. I work with Tom Quinn. And today I'm going to be telling you about some work I've been doing. I'm very excited to share this with you. We've been running some N-body simulations to actually directly model the terrestrial planet formation process, starting with nearly realistic sized planetesimals. Um, so just for some quick background, the types of systems we're focused on modeling are called systems of tightly packed inner planets, or STIPs. These are really interesting to study. For one, the structure of these is very different than the structure of our solar system. And for two, there's a lot of information we can gather from these. Not only do we have like individual, in a lot of cases, masses, radii, orbital periods for the planets, but looking at sort of the system as a whole, it gives us a lot of clues into their possible formation histories. So there's basically three different pathways, formation theories for these systems. I'm going to be focusing on in-situ formation. So this is the idea that basically there was this disk of solids, and the planets basically formed from whatever local concentration of solids there was. Some more complicated theories involve interactions with the gas disk as the planets grow larger. For simplicity, I'm going to be mostly ignoring these in this talk today. So just to give you a very brief overview of how this works, it's sort of split up into two stages. So a lot of previous studies start with just sort of modeling like a very narrow annulus of planetesimals. The reason for this is you have to take lots and lots of tiny time steps to actually model this process. But sort of what happens is these planetesimals sort of collide and grow, and gravitationally interact. And as this happens, you get this exchange of energy and angular momentum. And you sort of end up with, you might expect that everything just sort of coalesces into a few large bodies. This turns out to not be the case. You end up with sort of this bimodal distribution of mass where you get these few large bodies we call embryos or oligarchs. And you have this sort of residual planetesimal population that gets heated up dynamically by the oligarchs as they grow. So the second stage of this process sort of involves, once you have all these embryos formed, there's this large scale instability that occurs, and you get these larger bodies going into crossing orbits. You get these giant impacts, and this is what actually produces these sort of roughly Earth-sized planets in a lot of cases. And these two stages are usually studied separately. A lot of planet formation simulations actually start at the beginning of the second phase. But like I mentioned, we're actually starting with planetesimals and tracing this all the way forward till we actually form planets. So again, I'm sort of ignoring a lot of the important interactions with the gas disk. It's not really clear what the structure of the gas disk looks like in the inner regions of where these planets form. We don't have any observational data on this yet, so I'm largely going to ignore it. So we're mostly just modeling the gravity and collisions. And like I mentioned, a lot of these previous studies just sort of start out with these neatly spaced embryos and sort of let them go and see what planets they form. So to actually model this all the way from planetesimals, we actually have to use two different simulation codes to do this. So we start out with this planetesimal disk that we run with Changa. So I've done some work over the last few years implementing a solid body collision module in Changa. And once we actually form our embryos, the timescales of evolution get a lot longer. We need to take much larger time steps. And so I use this mixed variable symplectic code called Ganga to actually do this. So the main difference between these two codes is with Ganga, you sort of smear out all of the mass of the bodies onto their orbit, and you sort of treat your gravitational potential as approximately Keplerian. And you sort of treat the gravitational interactions between the bodies as perturbations. And this works really good as long as you don't have lots and lots of bodies that are interacting all at the same time, which is true once you get further along in evolution, you have less particles. So what I did is so with Changa, we started out with this disk of 1 million self-interacting colliding planetesimals. These are all about a few hundred kilometers in size. And this disk extends from about 1 to 100 days in orbital period. So it's this really wide region that we're actually modeling. So the interesting thing we found is this planetesimal accretion process, this oligarchic growth process, actually works differently depending what orbital period you're at. And on this bottom plot, you can sort of see I drew this vertical line interior to about 60 days here. basically oligarchic growth stops working. You don't end up with this bimodal distribution of bodies anymore. You sort of have this free-for-all, and just everything sort of coalesces into a few large bodies, like I was describing before. But the really interesting thing is you get this boundary partway out in the disk. So to sort of look at this a little more closely, I'm showing you the mass distribution of bodies in the inner and outer part of the disk. So again, in the outer part, you sort of end up with this power law distribution of bodies. And you have a few of these large oligarchs that sort of detach from the distribution and sort of dominate the dynamics. And this is not true closer in. Again, you sort of have this free-for-all, and everything just sort of grows in this pairwise way. But it's really exciting that you have sort of these two different modes of growth that are actually operating simultaneously here. So you might be wondering what's going on. I guess a really simple way to explain what's happening here is with this parameter called alpha. So this is the ratio between the size of your bodies and the Hill radius of the bodies. So as you move closer or further from the star, this Hill radius actually grows or shrinks, because as you get closer to the star, the gravitational potential field gets steeper, so you have a smaller region where the gravity of the body actually dominates. So basically, once you get close enough, these two size scales actually become comparable. And when this happens, when you try to start growing bodies and go through this oligarchic growth process, it's really hard to actually scatter objects off of each other, basically because their Hill radius is smaller than the actual size of the body. And so that sort of shuts down this sort of typical planetesimal accretion process that is in the literature. So this alpha parameter actually stays constant with mass. So as things grow, both these quantities scale as mass to the 1/3. So no matter what phase of evolution you're in, at a given distance from the star, alpha is the same. So I'm showing this kind of simple parameter study I did on the right here. So in this case, I just changed the radius of our particles. So I'm playing with the numerator here in our ratio I show on the left. So for large alpha, you basically end up with all the mass going into a few large bodies. And for small alpha, you again sort of end up with this sort of bimodal distribution that I was talking about. So a few other things we can do. You can actually go and look at some of the statistics of collisions. That's kind of the really powerful result from running this with these direct n-body simulations. So I'm measuring this thing I call the smooth accretion mass fraction, to sort of borrow from galaxy evolution. So this is basically for a given body at the end of the simulation, what fraction of its mass was attained through collisions with the initial planetesimals. I split this into the inner and outer disk. You can see as bodies grow, as they get larger, this quantity scales differently depending which growth regime we're in. So you can see there's something different happening in the inner and outer disk here. So kind of the key takeaway from the first part of this is, if you start out with the smoothly varying planetesimal disk, it doesn't produce the smoothly varying distribution of embryos like a lot of people assume when they do planet formation simulations. The really interesting part is actually going and running these all the way to full-size planets. So because stochasticity plays such an important role in this giant impact phase, I ran multiple versions of these simulations. And so we're just wondering, like, does this sort of artifact from this accretion boundary actually persist through to the final orbital architecture of the planets? And looking at these movies, it's not really clear whether or not that's true. So we go through and actually try measuring some global statistics for these planetary systems, sort of one set number you can measure for each system to try to compare how similar it is to another. So I'm showing two quantities here. The y-axis is angular momentum deficit. This is sort of a measure of how eccentric the bodies are in the system, how eccentric their orbits are. And this quantity on the x-axis is this radial mixing statistic. So it's sort of telling you for each simulation how far the final planets actually were able to reach to actually accrete solid material. So the colored points here are the full simulations I ran. The gray points are simulations I ran when I started with these nice, neatly spaced embryos like I was talking about. And you can see, especially with the radial mixing statistic, these distributions sort of overlap, but it definitely looks like you get less radial mixing when you have this accretion boundary present. I'm not really clear why that is yet, but I thought that was sort of interesting. I guess sort of the more interesting result is if you go through and run a bunch of these simulations, we can go and actually paint compositions onto the sort of the base of the collision tree, the planetesimals, and then propagate that up to the final planets that form and make composition predictions for them. So we're still sort of working on this. I've just done something very rudimentary here, which was to basically plop a snow line down at 20 days and measure how much wet and dry material there is in each planet that forms. So despite the fact that all the initial conditions are very similar, you'll notice in a couple of these cases, in the second and third box, we ended up with planets that were a little bit more massive, and there are fewer of them. So in some of these cases, there's some extra sort of instability that's happening. And you can see that the amount of radio mixing seems to be a lot greater in those cases. So there was a study from about 6 years ago, Kat Volk and Brett Gladman were trying to explain why the solar system doesn't have any short period planets. And their theory was that all these exoplanet systems we look at are, for the most case, metastable. Just if you wait long enough, you're going to undergo an instability. So the idea was the solar system used to have STIPs, and some instability occurred, which actually destroyed them. So you're too deep in the gravitational well this close to the star to actually eject things. But the idea is if you get giant impacts that are energetic enough, you can actually produce a bunch of dust, and this dust actually gets removed from the system from radiation from the star. So this plot on the left is from their paper. They're measuring basically the speed of a giant impact divided by the escape velocity. So anything above 2 on here on the y-axis should generally be destructive. So I went through and did the same measurement for some of our simulations, and we do indeed see that some of these collisions, should be, particularly towards the end of the giant impact phase, should be, somewhat destructive. So we might be seeing something similar here, in that some fraction of the systems, the STIPs are just going to get destroyed. Okay, so I'm just about out of time, so I'll leave my conclusion slides up. The really important thing here is, again, we sort of ran these direct n-body simulations, taking planetesimals all the way to the sort of fully formed terrestrial planet phase. And this oligarchic growth process doesn't scale to arbitrarily short orbital periods, and it actually leaves this sort of boundary in the distribution of embryos that form. And this may leave some sort of an imprint on the actual final orbital architectures. And it looks like some subset of these systems actually might, have a potentially destructive accretion history that removes a lot of the solid material. So my email is down here in the bottom right if any of you want to contact me, and I'll be happy to take questions.
All right, are there any questions here? Yeah, sure.
Hi, this is Joey Ruska. Thanks for the talk. I had a question about your composition plot, that split that you had, the snow line that you plot down. I just wondered if you looked at, as far as I understand, the solar system, like asteroids and Kuiper Belt objects have a dichotomy in composition that's kind of like this, that the inner stuff is separate from the other stuff. I wonder if you looked at that at all.
Right. So, I mean, the big difference here is we don't have these giant planets with these mean motion resonances that are sort of stirring things up and flinging things around. We'll actually be looking at that in the coming year, but yeah, we haven't done that yet. That's sort of the next step, though.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, way in the back. Could you use your seat microphone, please? There's a button to your right.
Do you see any evidence of the planets being in resonances?
Yeah, so one, in this case, no. But yeah, like you're asking, in a lot of cases with any kind of interaction with the gas disk, you're going to expect some sort of convergent migration, which generally places planets into resonant chains. The TRAPPIST-1 system has this very nice, beautifully set up configuration of resonant chains. But yeah, that's not something that gets produced here because there's not really any dissipative force that's sort of trying to move everything in towards the star.
Okay, so that's all the time we have. Can we thank our speaker again? And can the next speaker come up?
Hey everybody, I'm Joey Ruska. I'm a student with James Wadsley's at McMaster. I'm just going to talk about some of my work on planetesimal formation. So I'll start with a brief overview of some of the growth stages in the planet formation process, and I'll introduce the kind of simulations that we run. The bulk of this talk will be focused on a new project that we've been working on that models multiple grain sizes simultaneously, which is something new to these kinds of simulations. And then we're going to look at the impacts this has on the surface density distribution, some observational consequences of that, and what that does to the planetesimal or planet formation process in general. So dust and protoplanetary disks, the kind of stuff you might see with ALMA starts off with about millimeter and centimeter size. After the ISM dust, those micron grains settles in, it collides and grows and sticks together. And what you're left with is about centimeter and millimeter size stuff. I like to think of this as like grains of sand, essentially. And then the next stage this stuff has to grow onto is like planetesimals, which are what Spencer was just talking about. Asteroid-sized objects, think kilometer or 10 kilometers in size. And then like in Spencer's work, like once you get like a billion of these kinds of things, they grow together and collide and become protoplanets. And based on how these objects interact with the disk, they might become gas giants, may become rocky planets. There's a lot of details there. My focus is going to be on this very first stage. How do we go from this sand ALMA type stuff to planetesimals? Because there's a couple of well-constrained issues with this process. So once these objects grow to become about a meter in size, the headwind that they feel as they orbit around the disk and the gaseous part of the disk will rob them of angular momentum. And this effect is actually quite quick, like 100 years, which is quicker than about anything else, any other time scale to do with this growth process. And the second one is there's destructive collisions. So again, somewhere in around a meter, might be 10 centimeters. Any collisions between these grains are going to be at a high enough velocity that they'll actually destroy each other rather than grow. So we need something that is able to go directly from this millimeter-sized dust to planetesimals. And such a mechanism was proposed several years ago, known as a streaming instability. And so the kind of simulations we run are little patches of protoplanetary disks. So this is a shearing box within a disk. And what we see as happens is as the dust settles to the midplane and we get a very high ratio of the dust gas mass locally, as we've seen here, this dramatic instability takes over and you get these filaments, very non-linear, highly dense structures. And then if you look towards the middle, maybe I might just middle to avoid becoming nauseous looking at the edges of this. You get these bright objects. There's a few pixels wide, and those are these bound clumps. So this checks a lot of the boxes for the constraints that I'd mentioned in the previous slide. The first simulation of this from Johansson in 2007, it's a Nature paper, is very exciting because it just went very quickly. We're talking about tens of years here. We're not talking about gig years and redshift like we've heard a lot of in this meeting. So it's a very quick process. So what we wanted to ask in this recent project is that's previous simulation and most other simulations in this type of subfield use only a single size of grains for their model. So all dust was modeled by a single size of grains. We wanted to see if we had multiple grains simultaneously, what would that do to this process? So the simulations I run are in Athena. And so this is a grid code, and the dust is modeled using Lagrangian particles that interact with the grid and exchange momentum. Our size of grains that we picked comes from this well-cited model from Bernstein et al. It's a result of equilibrium between growth and fragmentation in these kind of like mid-plane of the disk regions. And so here's a snapshot of one of our simulations. We have two columns with the 6 grains that we've got. So I'm trying to use this pointer. What's at the top? Forget about it. In the top left there, you've got the very smallest grains. And in the bottom, we got the larger grains. The size is controlled by this parameter here. It's a dimensionless drag stopping time. We don't need to know the details right now. If you want to just keep in your mind, it's linear in size. And these grains, when you convert to physical units, are about millimeter. And then these grains are about centimeter in size. So what do we see? Right off at the bat, we can see that the larger grains down here, these ones are similar to what we saw in the last simulation. They're actually the same value. You get the filaments, you get the planetesimals, you get these very dramatic structures where you have very dense mass and condensed filaments and really empty amounts of mass between them. And then the smallest grains don't participate in the streaming instability much. Now, this is a known consequence of the streaming instability. Drag is very dependent on things like size. And we know that smaller grains will have slower growth rates. And in these kind of stratified setups might be just totally or stable against the instability. What's surprising is that they don't participate even in the presence of other grains that are also doing the instability. So there's filaments around them, but they're not in the filaments. So overall, we end up with the total dust surface density that looks like this kind of simulation. So how does this compare with some of this previous work? So we have a suite of simulations. So we have a bunch of simulations that use multiple grains here. This is our 6 bins, as I was talking about before, and then there's a few that we just wanted to check with convergence. So we have some with 12 and 18 bins as well. And then over on the far left side of the screen, that's from previous work, and this uses single sizes, as I said before. You might wonder what's different between the multiple runs here. All the physical parameters and numerical parameters are actually the same, and it's kind of the theme that we've heard about a bit this morning. We're just looking at the stochasticity that's present in this process. So the only thing that's different is the seed that places the dust particles initially in the initial condition. So everything's the same. The overall dust distribution is the same. It's just the initial noise field that's different. Yeah, and so what do we see between these simulations? Kind of as I said before, we've got in the same with the simulations with multiple grains, we've got the filaments, we've got the planetesimals, but there's a lot more material in between the filaments here than we would see in the single size simulations on the left. And we were wondering what would this do for observational consequences. So if you look at, if there's more material in the middle here, and there's less on the outside. And then also, if we look at the PDF of the dust surface density, this pops out as well. We have the single size grains have dust much more surface density at these low values. And if you look closely on the far end of the distribution as well, they have more the dense structures. So we apply just a simple emission model to this. We're just going to model like observational emission to be proportional as 1 minus exponential with the optical depth. Just modeling the optical depth with an opacity times the surface density here. If we convert each of these pixels into emission from this pixel, then we would expect these to be brighter in the middle. And if these structures are a little bit more dense, it's hard to tell by looking at them. Those would be more subject to saturation from optical depth effects as well. So one last thing we're going to do before we move on is that, or before we finish the analysis, is that we're going to average the intensity over the box. And so one thing I skipped over a little bit was that these features are very small, sub-AU, very much sub-AU. So no observational telescope is going to be able to observe this. So we're going to take an average of the intensity map that we get from this conversion. And then we're going to compare that to what do we have to the emission that we would get from a uniform box if there's just no clumping at all. And this is the kind of mass conversion factor that we would get if we did that. So we compare the emission that we would get from all the clump simulations and the emission to the emission that we get if there was no clumping at all, just uniform. And what jumps out is that we get it for, in intermediate optical depths, you would actually underestimate the amount of mass that is present because some of it's going to be hidden in these clumps that are saturated. And so you end up missing about 20 or up to 80%, depending on what model you use here. The red are ones with multiple grains, and the blues are the ones with a single size or a really tight distribution. So this is something we think is kind of interesting. It points to the fact that if you want to make accurate measurements of the dust mass from observations of disks, such as ones with ALMA, if you think the streaming instability is active in that region, there's going to be this little bit of uncertainty due to the fact that there might be clumping that you're not resolving. And then this is kind of a new thing that we're looking at in these kinds of simulations. So the last kind of set of results I wanted to look at was what does this look like when we look at clumps? So do all the grains participate in clumps equally? So we identify a clump with a simple density cut. So we go through our simulation grid. Any dust density that is above this hill density here. So the hill density is the threshold against gravitational collapse, compares the gravitational strength versus the rotational shear. Anything above that is going to be on its way to gravitational collapse, and we're just going to call that as being gravitationally bound. And so we collect all those cells together, call them planetesimals, and we ask, do all grain size participate in this process equally? And so this is a plot of the total mass that's in clumps over time in our simulation. So I've stacked the different grains on top of each other. So here's the different grains and colors on the top, and we can see the pink and the cream and the brown. I've chose these colors because it reminds me of Neapolitan ice cream. I think it's cute. So we can see the larger grains as expected, as you would see by eye. This kind of pulls out in a more quantitative way. Those grains primarily are the ones that are participating in clump formation. The smaller grains, the absolute smallest ones that were very thin, that we saw no structure in at all, they don't appear on this scale. And the ones right above it as well are also diminished. Their width is not as thick in this as well. And then if you look at the particles that are lost by clumps, we identify a clump in snapshot 1, look at snapshot 2, the same clump, look at all the particles that are not common or that were lost by going from snapshot 1 to snapshot 2. And we can see that the distribution is a little bit different. It's actually primarily the smaller grains, these ones in blue and gray, that are proportionally lost in this process. So again, we're trying to pick apart kind of the different dynamics going on in these particles. There's, you can look at this a different way. So if you want to look at just the histogram here of, this is density on the x-axis and the velocity on the y-axis. And these are the very smallest grains, the ones that don't participate in clumps. They're very thin. They are well out at this part of the parameter space, low densities, high relative velocities. This curve is an equilibrium curve that you would expect if the dust and gas were just kind of drifting through each other. And then this is a histogram for grains that are doing strong clumping. So you see they live in very different parts of this histogram. There's kind of just other evidence that these grains are doing things very different when it comes to the clumps. So in conclusions, we can see that this clumping of dust can result in underestimates of the underlying dust surface density in observations, and that the smaller grains do not readily form clumps compared to the larger ones. Future work, it would be really interesting if anybody wants to do a PhD project in this to dynamically model grain growth. I think there's a lot of open questions in terms of how this would look like in these simulations. And then the big picture is we just want to know how does the planet formation process get started, because there's a lot of uncertainties when it comes to this particular process in particular. And it seems that the best way to do it is with these kind of empirical numerical studies. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I think it's a really interesting question. And so that's all I've got. I'll take questions.
All right, are there any questions? Yeah, Tom.
This is really interesting stuff. But there is this this thing called the millimeter barrier, right? That grain collisions could be erosive. And so,
yeah. So
how do you consider grain collisions, or even sort of figured out what kind of velocity your grains are colliding with each other, and is that a problem?
Yeah. So the meter barrier is kind of like a name that within this community has been a little bit tossed out because it represents actually a wider phenomenon of which exactly you've talked about. It depends a lot on the local disk parameters, how much turbulence you have in terms of are the millimeter collisions destructive, or is it centimeter? Those depend a lot on what you assume the local turbulence to be. So I see a lot of people carry on that say that barrier is actually more like 10 centimeters, but it depends on a lot where you are on the disk. So yeah, that's the same thing. When I said the meter barrier, I'm kind of referring to it as like a broader phenomenon.
Do you look at grain collision rates?
No, we don't
and
here.
What velocities they're hitting each other with?
There's another student in our group who's taken up a project on that I think is really interesting, but it hasn't come to fruition yet. But I think that's a really interesting question in terms of what does grain growth look like in these simulations in terms of collisions and so on.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
He used is post all that processing. So he's starting with an equilibrium distribution, including destruction and right. So we're sort of in the safe place. And just for the benefit of this community, Joey and I put a lot of work into trying to do this in SPH, and it was not friendly to SPH.
Yeah, so
that's why we're using Athena. If anyone's curious about why that was painful, we'll be happy to talk about that. Maybe Mongo would be good. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank our speaker again.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Harrison Agrusa. I'm a PhD student from the University of Maryland. I work with Derek Richardson on a lot of different things, but mostly all something somehow to do with binary asteroids in one way or another. So we'll start with a little bit of background. So binaries are super common for the near-Earth asteroid population. They make up maybe 15%, which indicates there's some kind of very efficient production mechanism for these binaries. And most of these binaries are what we'll call singly synchronous. So like this animation I have up on the top, you can see it. You have a fast rotating oblate primary with a secondary on a very close orbit, and it's circular and it's a tidally locked body, and it's typically somewhat elongated. Another example is the Didymos binary asteroid, which is the target of NASA's DART mission, which is what I spend most of my time on. And this will be the first mission to a binary asteroid, which was kind of the motivation to start looking at this question again. And so that's just a representation of like how we can simulate that binary PKD graph. So these types of binaries, the secondary is usually 20% or less the mass of the primary. And again, like I said, it's on a tight orbit, maybe 2 or 3 primary diameters separate the two bodies. But there's also other categories of that are like binary related. So we got doubly synchronous binaries, which are typically closer to equal mass, and they're both tidally locked to each other, but they're a little farther separated more than these singly synchronous systems because they're more tidally evolved. We have contact binaries, which are just like a doubly synchronous binary, except they're touching. They've evolved back in due to a process called the binary Yorp effect. We have high eccentricity binaries, which look just like these singly synchronous systems, only their orbits are eccentric, and it makes the secondary it's in a chaotic tumbling state. We have triples, which just look just like the singly synchronous systems, only they've got a third body, maybe on a farther orbit that's stable. We have reshaped singles, which look like Ryugu and Bennu here, which were respectively visited by Hayabusa 2 and OSIRIS-REx recently. And so the question here is, were these binaries at one point and they lost their companion, or did they form that way? And finally, we have asteroid pairs, which are not bound to each other, but based on their heliocentric orbits, we know they were at one time a binary, and they would have evolved and separated through tides or something like that. Okay, so we know that these binaries have to be forming through some type of rotational mechanism, because if you look at them and you add up the total angular momentum, so the spins of the bodies and their orbits, that angular momentum matches very closely the maximum angular momentum that system could have if all the mass was concentrated in one body. And so we can explain this by something called the Yorp effect. And fundamentally, it's just because photons carry momentum. So if an asteroid is small enough and it's close enough to the sun, radiation forces are strong enough to impart a torque to the body. So it's going to absorb solar radiation, re-emit that thermally. And there's a little toy model on the right. Obviously, since 2000, these models have gotten a little more sophisticated, but I'm just trying to paint the picture here. They're going to re-emit that thermal radiation in a slightly asymmetric way, which provides a very small torque to the body, which can change its spin rate on a scale of maybe a few million years, maybe even less, depends on the shape of the body, the size of the body, and its heliocentric orbit. But this is less than its typical near-Earth dynamical lifetime. And so what's happening here is these bodies start off in the main belt, get perturbed, come into the Earth space, and form a binary during that process. So it's kind of interesting. They're coming in as near-Earth objects as singles, and they become binaries. And then there's another thing I want to mention now is called stochastic Dorp, and it's because this Yorp effect might be very sensitive to the shape of the body. So maybe a boulder moves on the surface or a very small landslide occurs, and now both the direction and the magnitude of this torque can change. And so that it can do kind of a random walk. So that's just a concept I want to bring up now because I'll mention it in a moment. Okay, so there's two sort of proposed formation theories. They're both sort of rotational driven, but they differ on the exact details. So the first one is this sort of slower mass shedding process. These are some old PKD graph simulations. They do a good job of explaining the architectures of these bodies, but runs into a few issues because the idea here is that you're slowly shedding mass as you're spinning up, but if Yorp is stochastic, it's really hard to do that. These simulations use hexagonal close packed particles. They use this hard sphere treatment, which is probably not the best way to deal with prolonged contacts of granular systems. And then the particle resolution is kind of low. I have an asterisk there because if you think that the building blocks of these rubble pile asteroids is this particle size, then it's actually not a problem, right? We were discretely modeling it, but we actually don't know what these building blocks are. There's this other idea, which I'll kind of call asteroid fission, which is where the body hits its critical spin limit once, it fissions a body, secondary that undergoes chaotic rotation, that might fission again. And you go through this sort of stochastic dynamical process until you arrive at some long-term stable system. There's a lot of details there, but basically it probably does a better job of matching the general population statistics, but there's some other problems there, including in this model, you're choosing the masses and the shapes of the bodies. I think it'd be a little more realistic to allow the masses and shapes to form sort of self-consistently with gravity and collisions. So what I'm trying to do is sort of combine the best of the two. Solve the stochastic Dorp problem by saying the body fails at once, sheds a bunch of material in orbit, and then that's going to gravitationally accumulate into your secondary. So that's sort of the long story short. So step one to get to this theory is better contact physics. So over the years since the Walsh papers, our group, various students in our group have added sort of a better contact module in PKD-Grav for dealing with this type of a problem. So it's called the soft sphere discrete element method, wherein particles overlap each other. You apply like a mediating spring force, and then we have treatments for rolling, static, twisting, friction, and things like that to do a better job of modeling a granular system. And then part two is we make one assumption about the internal structure of these bodies, and that is that the interiors of the bodies have more strength. So what I do in these simulations is this sort of gold region is locked into a rigid body, and then those top two layers, the colors don't mean anything, they're treated the same. Those top two layers are just a layer of regolith. I do have time to go into this, I think. So this is sort of an artificial choice, but it's going to force the system to fail in the right way to form a secondary. So it is an assumption here, but it's a fairly well motivated assumption because one, if these progenitor bodies originally formed by some catastrophic disruption, then gravitational reaccumulation, you'd expect a few larger chunks to be on the interior of the bodies, and then over time, regolith is going to build up on the surface from micrometeorite impacts and stuff. So it's reasonable to assume the interior might be a little bit stronger, and it's also consistent with some findings at Bennu. For example, the depth to diameter ratio of craters on Bennu doesn't scale the way we think. As you form a bigger and bigger crater, they don't go deeper as you would expect. It's like they're hitting a wall because the interior might be a little bit stronger or more cohesive. Okay, so what we're going to do is vary the size of this rigid core. I'm actually going to only show you simulations from that top one just to save some time. Then we're also going to vary the friction angle of the material. So we're varying the material parameters. And so a friction angle is like if you poured out a pile of sand, it's just the angle that it would sit at, the angle of repose. And if we're going to be talking about sand, I have to throw in this funny comic from XKCD. Okay, so yeah, all I'm doing right now in these simulations is just Newton laws and sand, nothing else. Okay, so the first one, let's say we have low friction. I'll give the material a friction angle of 29 degrees. We're going to quasi-statically spin it up until it starts landsliding, and then I turn off the spin-up process. So in a moment, it'll fail, but because this friction angle is low, it fails at a low spin rate, so these particles don't have enough energy or speed to get into orbit. So it never forms a binary. So maybe this would explain our single reshaped population, like our Bennus and Ryugus. Now, if we increase the friction angle to something like 32 degrees, it's going to fail at a slightly higher spin rate. So when it fails, these particles have enough speed, they're going to go into orbit. Okay. Now, what I'll do is we'll fast forward maybe 10 days or something, and you see we've started accumulating a secondary. In a moment, you're going to see the secondary actually becomes tidally locked extremely rapidly. The reason why is because it's forming right at the Roche radius. Of course, it can't form closer than that because it get ripped apart. And so it becomes tidally locked because if the body's going to be elongated because of the strong tidal environment it's in, also if it becomes misaligned, it's just going to get reshaped by the tides. And so you're able to form a tidally locked body like the population we see within maybe dozens of orbit periods after formation. So you don't have to invoke any knowledge about how tidal dissipation works in rubble piles, because if you go look at the papers, nobody knows how tides work on rubble piles. You'll read one big theory paper by like a Peter Goldreich, and it says, you know, the tidal love number K scales with R. You go read another one, they'll say it scales as 1 over R. So people don't know. So if we can form a tidally locked secondary without needing to know how tides work, that's good. And then we also don't have to invoke all these multiple fission events. We just need one catastrophic event where we just exceed the spin barrier once. So we don't need to worry about stochastic Dorp because we're only landsliding one time. Now, if we increase the friction angle even more, we're going to fail at even faster spin rate. So we're going to shed a ton of material. And then if the AV people could maybe like skip the video to halfway, because it's like 2 or 3 minutes and we'll be here forever. But anyway, so we'll shed a bunch more material. This is going to accumulate into a much bigger body, and eventually you almost get to like a critical, something like there would be perfect. We start getting close to like an equal mass system because the primary is still spinning really quickly. So it's really easy to pull material off of its equator. And so you get this sort of runaway effect where maybe you get close to this equal mass binary. Once the binaries are equal mass, tides become a lot more efficient. Even though we don't really understand how the tides work on rebel piles, we know they're at least going to be more efficient when it's equal mass. So maybe you run the simulation long enough and they're going to become tidally locked, and that explains your doubly synchronous systems. And then you can explain your contact binaries by once they become tidally locked, binary Yorp effect kicks in, which imparts torque to the binary orbit, which can actually shrink or expand the orbit. So you can shrink them and have them untouched. So it's all we have to do is change this friction angle, and we can kind of get this wide diversity of binary systems. But the biggest challenge here is computing time. So to do the contact physics correctly with soft sphere discrete element method, we're going, we only want to do a simulation for like 50, 60 days, but we have to use a time step of a fraction of a second. So these take forever. It's only 20,000 particles, but it takes a long time. So that's a big challenge. And then the other question is, do we just get lucky? If I run this with a different random distribution of 20,000 particles, I don't know how much the outcome changes. So that's sort of the next step, is vary all these sorts of parameters and see how things change. And then the main goal is to, once this transient event has happened, you've cleared out all the material, you have your binary, you can hand that off to a dedicated full two-body code to study the secular evolution, let it evolve out through tides, see if the system remains attitude stable, right? Because as the secondary evolves out, it can hit various like higher order secondary resonances, like resonances between its spin precession frequency and the mean motion, and it can actually cause it to start tumbling. So we want to look at how long these systems can remain stable, and then start comparing that among the rest of the population. So that's the idea. It's probably going to be more of like a post-thesis project. It's going to take forever, but that's where I'm at right now. I'll take questions.
All right, any questions? Yeah, Alice.
Hi, Alison Brooks. So if it's just this friction angle that you're changing and getting all these different types of binaries, does that mean that you would predict that the different types of binary asteroids might be made of different material, or is there something else that sets that?
The friction angle here thing I'm doing, it's a little hand wavy. Right? You can also probably change the particle size distribution, and things might change. So it's not like a one, it doesn't like fit everything. But yeah, so to give you some context, we think that the maximum slopes we measure on like Bennu and Ryugu are like in the mid 30s or something. But if you paid attention, you'll notice that the one that formed my Bennu Ryugu had a friction angle of 29 degrees. So it's not like, right? It's not like I can set it to 32 degrees and I get exactly Bennu. So I think, if I ran a bunch of these same simulations, just varying the positions of the particles, I think you get a wide range of outcomes. So I want to be able to run a ton of these and get like a statistical sense of what's going on.
Other questions?
The timescale for Yorp is quite long, probably a lot longer than these simulations, right?
Yeah.
So what effect do you think that would have if you just sort of keep spinning these things up over a longer time?
Yeah, so the way we do is we spin them up quasi-statically, so that every time step we add, we spin the body up a little bit. We add some torque. We make sure the acceleration on every particle is less than the Euler acceleration, which is acceleration due to a changing rotating frame. Once any particles start landsliding, we turn off any spin up, because these are timescales of days, whereas, like you said, Yorp is a much longer timescale. So during this whole process, it'd probably be unrealistic to have any Yorp turned on, right? Because it's not the Yorp spin rate, or the spin up's not going to change on these timescales of tens of days. But yeah, we're not like realistically doing anything with that, if that makes sense.
I'm asking what would extra Yorp do?
Yeah. So one idea is Yorp timescale is long. Let's say this thing forms a binary. Tides are going to evolve it out. Maybe the secondary gets pretty far away, and then the primary keeps spinning up due to Yorp, and it could form another binary, and that forms your triples, right? That explains your triple population. If when Yorp causes the primary to make another satellite, the first satellite needs to be far enough away so it's on a stable orbit, and then you can form triples. So.
Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Andrew Ponson, I have a really quick one. I was really amazed that your biggest challenge is computing time. So it was really cool work, but that's quite something for 20,000 particles. Is that something you could solve just by going on a GPU or something for such a small?
So half the reason why some of us came here is we want to talk about the version of PKD ever we're using is like the one that was written in the late 90s, and then we've added all this stuff to it. So if we can do the gravity portion faster, I think the version we use makes 2 trees, one for gravity, one for a nearest neighbor search for the contact. So like there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. It's just a matter of finding people, students, postdocs that want to do it and then doing it. So yeah, it could definitely be sped up. That's for sure.
Okay, let's thank our speaker again. Now we'll do the flash talks. So first is Jackson Barnes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jackson Barnes. I'm a graduate student at Michigan State University, and I'm going to be talking about a new hybrid n-body model that my collaborator, Stephen Schwartz, and my advisor, Seth Jacobson, and I have started working on to create a more complete model of gravitational collapse to form binary systems. Planetesimal systems, rather. So as was already introduced by Joseph earlier, in the early solar system, there was dust and gas in the protoplanetary disk. And this dust was micrometer sizes, and these micrometer sized particles ultimately grew into pebbles, these centimeter sized pebbles. And eventually these centimeter sized pebbles induced a back reaction onto the gas dynamics, resulting in overdense axisymmetric and gravitationally bound filaments or clumps through the streaming instability. And upon reaching a critical density, these clumps collapsed to form planetesimals on the order of tens to hundreds of kilometers. And ultimately, this is a very efficient and practical method for planetesimal formation because it bypasses some of the meter barrier inhibitors for planetesimal formation. And previous models of gravitational collapse have used what we're coining as a cloud particle method. These cloud particles are effectively representing clouds of individual particles, right? And this bypasses a primary challenge of modeling pebble clouds, as real collapsing clouds contain a sextillion centimeter sized pebbles, which is unfeasible to ever directly simulate. So this allows these cloud particles effectively allow for lower resolution analog systems to be used instead. So instead of sextillion centimeter sized pebbles, we use 100,000 kilometer sized particles. And previous models used inflated radii to enhance the collision rate, because there'd be a lot of collisions effectively taking place at the start of the collapse process. But this resulted in unrealistically low densities for these particles and also precluded the tightest binary orbits to form. And a lot of these simulations also use perfect merger methods, which 2 particles collide, create a new spherical particle at the center of mass or the center of mass velocity. And the results of these simulations match relatively well to observed cold classical Kuiper belt objects, or the most pristine planetesimals left over from the onset of the early solar system. But there's no information regarding their shapes or spins. So effectively, we could say that the perfect merging models with cloud particles perform really well at the start of collapse, but perhaps not so much at the end, which is where my research effectively came in. And so what we use is the soft sphere discrete element method with 100,000 particles as well. And we created planetesimals as aggregates of particles. So our particles represent individual real particles with static sizes, and we're able to produce a wide range of planetesimal shapes. We can see in the bottom right, our binary system from one of my simulations has an oblate spheroid shape, and we're able to also monitor aggregate rotations. But because we do not use these cloud particles, we're not able to have an enhanced collision rate like the cloud particle systems. So we can also say that the aggregate particles perform better at the end of collapse as opposed to the cloud particle system. So our goal is to create take the best of both worlds for the cloud particle method and the aggregate particle method, and create a new hybrid n-body collisional model which incorporates key aspects of the perfect merger and soft sphere discrete element method models. And our goal is to, at the simulation start, have all particles be cloud particles so that we can effectively simulate real sextillion particle clouds with enhanced collision rates. We will have the cloud particles collide with one another and accrete, and upon reaching a transition mass or size, they will become aggregate particles. And we will then continue to run the simulations. And these aggregate particles will effectively be called planetesimals, and we will be able to monitor their shapes, rotations, orbits, as with the contact physics, as Harrison alluded to earlier, and we'll be able to create planetesimals as aggregates and have a more complete model of planetesimal formation. Thank you very much, and leave it up to the next speaker.
All right, Julian Moronic. Is that right? Moronic? Okay, Moronic, yeah.
No worries.
I'm so
okay.
sorry.
All right, 3 minutes. So the goal here is to basically, let's see. So, well, my name is Julian Moronic. I'm a graduate student at the University of Maryland, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about particle shape in the context of rubble piles. So, you've seen this. This is the asteroid Bennu. This is an example of a small solar system body. It's a clump gravitationally bound together of little bits and pieces. And people simulate these, as you've seen, with soft sphere or hard sphere contact physics. And typically, because of computational constraints, we use spherical particles. As you might imagine, these real particles are not spheres. They are all kinds of weird shapes. And that brings a lot of physics with it. These things interlock and change the way that the particles interact with each other. This is usually ignored due to computational constraints. It's difficult to do all these contact physics with non-spherical particles. So what's the solution? How do we get this physics into our code? Well, so we start with this modified version of pkdgraph that you just heard a little bit about. So we have this soft sphere contact physics. And basically, what we do is, in principle, quite simple. We just take these spherical particles and stick them together and force them to behave as rigid bodies. So the upside of this is that you get a lot of that contact physics without bringing on the additional expense of having all of these polyhedra or ellipsoids or whatever that have difficult to calculate contacts. And the upshot is, so here's some examples of that. Here's that pointer. You can see those at the bottom. You can pick any arbitrary shapes, but these are some basic options. And the upside is that you can now get this physics with tens to hundreds of thousands of particles, as opposed to, say, a few thousand, which is what has mostly been done so far. And then as far as applications, the ones we have started with so far, although you can imagine many, are, say, Yorp spin-up, tidal encounters, Brazil nut effect. We have different particles, sort of bigger things percolating to the top of rubble piles. And in the future, we'd like to add rolling and twisting friction as well. In the last 30 seconds, I'll show you a quick couple of demos. So this is a tidal encounter of a rubble pile made up of these non-spherical particles moving by the Earth. And so you might ask, how does particle shape affect how many of these clumps you form after a tidal encounter? What shapes are they? How do they come back together? And then for another example, you can see spin up. So similar initial setup, but this is, say, the result of a Yorp type spin up. And again, you can ask, how does binary formation change? How does reshaping change? This will effectively change the coefficient of friction, etc. So thank you for your attention. And that's all I have.
So our next talk is by Jillian Belts Mormon online.
Hi. Hold on, let me share my screen.
Who is not doing planetary science.
I'm not. Okay, can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great.
Wait, we can't see your screen.
You can see the screen?
We can't.
Oh, interesting. Can you see it for a second?
Jillian, if you could just reshare really quick.
Yeah.
That would be great. Thank you.
Can you see it now? Hello?
Oh. We can't see it. Yeah, just 1 second. Sorry.
Jillian, okay. We're not able to see your slides. If you're okay, we can share them for you. And if you just give us a notice to advance it.
Yeah, that's fine. Can you do version 3?
Yes, give us 1 second.
Thanks.
Okay, you're all set. Thank you.
Thank you. So hi, my name is Jillian Belts Mormon. I am a recent graduate of Vanderbilt University. And despite the session that I'm a part of, I'm going to tell you about recent updates in accurately modeling galaxy clustering on small scales. So back in 2018, Manadeep Sinha and collaborators developed a fully numerical MOC-based procedure for modeling the clustering of galaxies on small scales using a standard halo occupation distribution model. And this project involved a careful accounting of systematic errors using covariance matrices made from mock galaxy catalogs. And the project included a variety of galaxy clustering statistics for constraining their model. So in particular, they utilized the galaxy number density, the projected correlation function of galaxies shown here, and the group multiplicity function of galaxies shown here. And what they found was that using these statistics jointly to constrain their model led to the tightest constraints. And ultimately, their best fit model was in good agreement with the clustering of low luminosity SDSS galaxies, but exhibited moderate tension when fit to the clustering of higher luminosity SDSS galaxies. Next slide. So motivated by these results, Adam Seshu and collaborators in 2021 expanded on this procedure to include an even wider variety of galaxy clustering statistics. So shown here, they utilized a range of scales from the projected correlation function, the redshift space correlation function, the group multiplicity function, the average group velocity dispersion function, the mark correlation function, and counts and cells statistics. Additionally, they included a careful treatment of the impact of fiber collisions on their SDSS measurements, as well as included corrections to their halo mass functions due to the impact of baryonic physics on halo masses. Next slide. And ultimately, they found that including all of these new statistics allowed them to dramatically tighten the constraints on their halo model parameters compared to the previous results. But the tension in their best fit model increased dramatically for both SDSS samples. So now they were finding greater than 4 sigma tension between their best fit model and SDSS. Next slide. So motivated by this, I have been working on extending the standard halo model used in this project to include additional features that might help alleviate some of this tension. So in particular, I've included parameters for assembly bias to account for the possibility that halo occupation may depend on a secondary property of the halo in addition to mass, like concentration. And I've also included a parameter for velocity bias to account for the possibility that satellite galaxies do not trace the velocities of the particles in the dark matter halo. Last slide, or second to last slide. So after doing this, what I have found is that for the lower luminosity sample of galaxies, I detect both assembly bias and velocity bias to some degree, although assembly bias is very difficult to constrain. But ultimately, adding these new features to our halo model leads to a significant decrease in tension, and now our best fit model is in good agreement with the clustering of lower luminosity galaxies. Next slide. However, after adding these features to the models for the high luminosity sample of galaxies, I do not detect any significant assembly bias or velocity bias, and I also don't see any decrease in this 4 or 5 sigma tension. And given that we have added these new features to the model and we have included many improvements to the model and careful consideration of errors, it is worth considering the possibility that since none of these things have alleviated the tension whatsoever, that the clustering of high luminosity galaxies is maybe sensitive to an issue with our cosmological model. But there are lots of other things to consider, so stay tuned for future work. Thanks.
All right, are there any questions for any of the Flash Talk speakers? No questions? Okay, yeah, you can go first.
Hi, it's Andrew Ponce, and I had a question for Gillian. It sounds really interesting. I was just trying to get my head around the fact that when you add more free parameters, though, the tension is going up. I mean, I just kind of naively, intuitively expect tension always to go down when you have more free parameters. Could you say a word about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I'll mention is that based on comparisons to hydro simulations, we actually did not expect to find any assembly bias or velocity bias in the higher luminosity sample of galaxies. So the fact that we're not detecting it is consistent with previous work. The fact that the tension increases, we think, is probably just due to the fact that we're using slightly different clustering measurements between this paper and the previous paper. So we designed an algorithm to choose a set of clustering statistics that would be best designed for constraining the model that we're using. So since we added new features to the model, we chose a slightly different set of statistics. And we think that even though the statistics maybe have better constraining power for assembly bias, the change in statistics is leading to the increase in tension. But it's a good question.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, this is Joey. I just had a question for Julian about the rubble pile stuff. So I might have just missed this, you might have mentioned it, but it looked like, so your different shaped rubble pile constituents, you had like a string of spheres together, is that right? As opposed to like, I don't know, an oval shaped thing? I just wanted to double check that's what's going on.
Sure. Yeah. So the shapes I showed were a few different possibilities, and you can put them together in any arbitrary configuration, if that was your question.
Right, but yeah, so you're modeling them as spheres stuck together, as opposed to like a different like oval that's in.
Yeah. Yes, they're spheres just glued together.
Thanks.
I actually had a question about that too. They're like Tetris shapes, basically, right? And like, so like, is there any? It's like you're playing Tetris, like really expensive Tetris. So I mean, is there? But they're still pretty big, right? Like they look big compared to the size of the body. I mean, is there any motivation for that? I mean, it doesn't look like you'd see like an L-shaped thing that big next to an asteroid. So I mean, wouldn't you have to go like really higher resolution, I guess, to see something more realistic?
That's a great question. So the shapes are not necessarily meant to capture all of the possible, like it's not a grain to grain match, but the idea is that you do have boulders and bigger chunks that form the center of these objects, and at least in some sort of heuristic way, you can start to understand what the effect of having things, what effect qualitatively at least, and then quantitatively does shape have on the way these things move past each other, even if it's not a direct one-to-one comparison of, you know, every single particle in a rubble pile.
Right. Okay. Cool. Thanks. So I think that's it. Oh, I think we'll end it there, and we'll just do the coffee break. So if we can thank the speakers again.